When the United Nations imposed unprecedented sanctions on Ibrahim Traore, thinking they would isolate the young Burkina Faso president, they couldn't have predicted what would happen next. What started as international punishment became the catalyst for the most powerful display of African unity in decades. Tonight, we reveal how a calculated move to weaken one man accidentally strengthened an entire continent, and why global powers are now scrambling to undo what they've done. The morning sun cast long shadows across the corridors of the United Nations. Headquarters in New York as diplomats hurried through marble hallways, their faces etched with concern. In less than 24 hours, they would make a decision that would backfire spectacularly, creating the very outcome they were desperately trying to prevent. The air conditioning hummed softly in Conference Room 2046, a nondescript meeting space tucked away on the 20th floor of the UN building. Unlike the Grand Assembly Hall, where cameras captured world leaders addressing humanity, this room was designed for conversations that would never see daylight. The heavy oak table reflected the worried faces of 5 men who represented some of the world's most powerful nations. Ambassador Richardson from the United States adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses as he studied the classified intelligence report spread before him. The document, stamped with red letters reading "Eyes Only," contained detailed analysis of Ibrahim Traoré's recent activities that had alarmed Western capitals from Washington to Paris. "Gentlemen," Richardson began, his voice carrying the weight of years spent in diplomatic corridors, "we have a problem. Traoré isn't just another African strongman we can manage with the usual playbook. His anti-colonial rhetoric is spreading like wildfire across the continent." The French representative, Ambassador Dubois, leaned forward, his manicured fingers drumming against the polished wood. "The situation in Burkina Faso has moved beyond our comfort zone. Every site Claire visited ended up compromised, not always destroyed but exposed. Rebel groups who had hidden for years suddenly found themselves outflanked, targeted, eliminated. Yet she always walked away unscathed. Not once had her convoy been attacked. Not once had she needed extraction. At first, the assumption was a leak in military communications, but encrypted networks held firm, no breaches, no bugs. Then came the realization that chilled even Yarrow. What if the leak wasn't technical? What if the intel wasn't stolen but given? Claire's laptop, her satellite phone, her tablet, all allowed under NGO clearance, could quietly transmit geolocation data without triggering suspicion. Her presence wasn't a risk. It was the bait. The perfect Trojan horse, masked as empathy, Yarrow. Brought the findings to President Traoré in silence. Traoré didn't look up from the map on his desk. His fingers traced the next likely target. Claire was already scheduled to visit it. His voice, when it finally came, was razor thin. "Pull surveillance from her hotel. I want to know who she calls at night." The sun was already sinking over Dori when the ambush hit. A military convoy transporting wounded soldiers from a skirmish near the Niger border was blown apart just outside the city's edge. The route had been classified. Only 4 people knew the timing, and Claire Morrow had met with 2 of them earlier that morning, bringing supplies, checking names, asking detailed questions under the guise of coordination. Captain Yarrow stood over the wreckage that night, the scent of diesel and blood still thick in the air. A young lieutenant's body lay crumpled against a tree, his hand still clutching a radio. Yarrow's jaw tightened. He didn't need orders anymore. The pattern wasn't a pattern. It was a signature. Claire, of course, was unharmed. She had left Dori an hour before the attack, citing unforeseen scheduling changes. Her driver confirmed the alibi. So did the hotel. But her satellite phone pinged just 5 kilometers from the site, 15 minutes before the bombs went off. President Traoré received the report in his private quarters. He didn't speak. Instead, he paced the tiled floor of his residence in silence, eyes narrowed, voice buried somewhere deep behind clenched teeth. Claire's face was on the cover of a French magazine on his desk. "An Angel in Africa," the headline read. He flipped it over. Later that night, Yarrow waited by the compound gates as Traoré emerged, jacket in hand, eyes like steel. He didn't bring his ministers, no press, no convoy, just Yarrow, and a decision heavy enough to shift the course of a nation. "She moves again," Traoré said, stepping into the jeep. "We follow." And as the engine roared to life, Yarrow asked the question that had haunted them both for days. "Do we arrest her for what she's done, or for who sent her?" Bobo Dioulasso Airport pulsed with its usual chaos. Vendors shouting, luggage carts rattling, foreign aid workers shuffling through security in pressed linen shirts. Claire Marot moved calmly through the terminal, scarf tucked neatly over her shoulder, passport in hand. She smiled at the guard who waved her through priority clearance, unaware, or pretending not to be, that two plainclothes officers were trailing her every step. Captain Yarrow stood in a maintenance corridor overlooking Gate 3, earpiece in, watching through tinted glass. President Traoré waited in a black SUV outside the terminal, engine running, his silence stretching like wire. The team had orders. No noise, no spectacle. But when Claire's suitcase went through inspection, the mood changed instantly. The customs officer paled. Inside the lining, a folded satellite uplink, military-grade encryption chip, and a badge, UN Blue. But the seal was wrong, fake. The materials were too clean, too perfect. Not humanitarian, intelligence. Yarrow moved fast. "Now," he said into his mic. Claire had just reached the boarding ramp when she was stopped. One man blocked the passage. Another took her arm. She didn't resist, didn't panic, just turned her head slowly and locked eyes with Yarrow as he approached. "This is a mistake," she said softly, almost amused. Then came the moment no one expected. Traoré stepped out of the SUV, crossed the tarmac alone, and walked directly to her. No guards, no press, just the president of the transition, staring down. A woman the world believed to be a saint. She leaned in, her voice barely audible. "You're not the only one who's been betrayed." Traoré froze, her breath still warm on his cheek. For a full second, the air around them thickened with something unspoken. Then his voice, flat and final. "Take her in, alive." Claire sat in the holding room beneath the presidential compound, her hands unshackled, her eyes sharp. The walls were bare concrete, the air stale, the silence deliberate. She hadn't asked for a lawyer. She hadn't asked for anything. She just waited. Captain Yarrow watched her from behind the mirrored glass, unease crawling under his skin. Traoré had ordered no interrogation. Not yet. Just observation. But it wasn't the spycraft that unsettled Yarrow. It was her calm, her certainty. As if this arrest was always part of her plan. President Traoré entered without ceremony. No security, no press, just him. A folder under his arm and the weight of a nation in his gaze. Claire looked up, folding her hands as if greeting a guest. "You've been busy," he said, dropping the folder onto the table. Photos spilled out. Burned convoys, bombed villages, intercepted calls, satellite coordinates. Her trail mapped like a crime scene. She glanced down, then back up. "You know those weren't my decisions," she replied. Traoré leaned in. "Then whose were they?" Claire didn't answer. Instead, she pulled a thin envelope from her sleeve and slid it across the table. Yarrow stiffened behind the glass. Traoré opened it. Inside were photographs, grainy but clear, of a secret meeting between a French oil executive, a Sahelian rebel leader, and a man wearing the insignia of a European peacekeeping unit. "You were never the target," Claire said, voice low. "You were the pawn." Traoré's jaw clenched. The pieces were shifting. She wasn't just feeding intelligence to Paris. She was unraveling it, and maybe, just maybe, trying to burn it down. He stared at her for a long moment, then quietly asked the question that had haunted him for weeks. "Why me?" Claire exhaled. "Because You're the only one they didn't expect to survive. The envelope didn't leave Traoré's sight for the next 12 hours. He locked it in a steel drawer, dismissed his aides, and summoned only one person. Colonel Fauna, Chief of Counterintelligence, a man who owed him loyalty from the trenches, not the palace halls. By sunrise, a second dossier lay open on the presidential desk. This one thicker, older, dirtier. It wasn't Claire Morrow who was rogue. It was the mission she'd infiltrated. Leaked communications between the French defense attaché and executives from a Paris-based energy consortium detailed covert operations, designed to destabilize the Sahel. The goal? Force resource-starved governments into lopsided mining contracts in exchange for military assistance. The rebels weren't just tolerated. They were assets, controlled chaos, and Claire, embedded to monitor the rebels, yes, but also to gather proof, not for France, for herself, for someone else. One document stood out, a transfer manifest for surveillance drones signed not by French officials, but a European Union humanitarian delegate. Traoré recognized the name. He'd shaken the man's hand in Brussels, smiled for photos. Claire had been feeding multiple channels. The question now wasn't whether she was a spy, it was whose spy. Later that afternoon, Traoré stood alone in the marble hallway outside the cell.
It would represent a fundamental shift in global power dynamics. The proposal on the table, Richardson said, opening a thick folder marked with the UN seal, is comprehensive. Targeted sanctions, personal asset freezes for Traoré and his inner circle, travel bans, arms embargoes, and most importantly, restrictions on international banking relationships for Burkina Faso. Dubois nodded approvingly. The goal is isolation. Cut him off from international finance, make it impossible for him to travel and build alliances, demonstrate to other African leaders that challenging the established order has severe consequences. And if it backfires? Asked Petrov, though. His tone suggested he already knew the answer. It won't, Thompson replied with British certainty. African leaders are pragmatic. When they see Traoré isolated and his economy collapsing, they'll distance themselves. No one wants to be on the wrong side of international law. The vote was swift and decisive. 4 nations in favor, 1 abstention from China. Within hours, legal teams were drafting the sanctions package. Intelligence agencies were preparing. Supporting documentation and diplomatic channels were being activated to ensure swift passage through the Security Council. None of them noticed Ambassador Chen's subtle smile as he gathered his papers, or the encrypted message he would send. To Beijing that evening, the West is about to make their biggest mistake in decades. Prepare to capitalize. The decision was made. The trap was set. What none of these experienced diplomats realized was that they had just lit the fuse on a powder keg that would explode in their faces, creating exactly the unified African resistance they were trying to prevent. The presidential palace in Ouagadougou stood majestically against the morning sky, its white walls gleaming in the intense African sun. Built during the colonial era but thoroughly reimagined by independent Burkina Faso, the building represented a blend of African architectural heritage and modern governance. Palm trees lined the circular driveway, where government vehicles arrived and departed with the steady rhythm of a functioning democracy. Inside his private office, Ibrahim Traoré sat behind a desk carved from local hardwood, its surface polished to mirror-like perfection. At 36 years old, he possessed the commanding presence that had made him a continental icon. But this morning, his usual confidence was tempered by the gravity of the news his aide had just delivered. "Mr. President," said Colonel Wedra Ogo, his chief of staff, placing a leather folder on the desk with ceremonial gravity. "The UN Security Council has passed Resolution 2847, comprehensive sanctions against Burkina Faso, effective immediately." Traoré opened the folder, his trained military mind quickly processing the legal language that would reshape his country's International relationships, asset freezes, travel bans, arms embargoes, banking restrictions. It was a textbook isolation strategy designed to strangle his government's ability to function on the global stage. "They're trying to make an example of us," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of understanding. "Show other African leaders what happens when you challenge the established order." "Sir, there's something else. Phone calls have been coming in since the news broke. Presidents from across the continent. They're not distancing themselves." Traoré looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" President Ibrahim Traoré from Senegal called personally, said his government doesn't recognize the legitimacy of sanctions against sovereign African nations. President Félix Tshisekedi from DRC sent a private message through encrypted channels. Even President Akufo-Addo from Ghana, despite his country's strong Western ties, expressed private concerns about the precedent this sets. The phone on Traoré's desk buzzed insistently. Colonel Urao glanced at the caller ID and his eyes widened. "Sir, it's President Ramaphosa from South Africa. Direct line." Traoré picked up the phone, switching to English. "Cyril, my brother." The familiar voice of South Africa's president came through clearly, warm but serious. "Ibrahim, I'm calling to let you know that what happened today at the UN is not sitting well with many of us down here. The African Union is convening an emergency session. I appreciate your support, but I don't want other nations to suffer consequences for standing with Burkina Faso." "That's exactly the mentality we need to change," Ramaphosa replied firmly. "For too long, we've allowed fear of Western retaliation to keep us divided. Maybe it's time to show the world that Africa can stand together." After the call ended, Traoré walked to the large window overlooking Ouagadougou's bustling streets. Street vendors sold colorful fabrics. Children played football in dusty lots between buildings.
And the normal rhythm of African urban life continued unchanged. These people had no idea that their young president had just become the target of international isolation designed to bring his government to its knees. What the sanctions architects hadn't calculated was the deep well of continental frustration that had been building for decades. Every unfair trade agreement, every imposed structural adjustment program, every time African resources left the continent only to return as expensive manufactured goods had added to a collective anger that was ready to explode. Colonel Ouedraogo returned with updates that defied every prediction the UN strategists had made. "Sir, President Touadéra from the Central African Republic just announced his government will not comply with sanctions against a fellow African nation. President Bio from Sierra Leone made a similar statement. This is unprecedented. They're not afraid anymore," Traoré realized, a smile slowly spreading across his face. For the first time in decades, African leaders are choosing continental solidarity over Western approval. The phone rang again. This time it was Colonel Goita from Mali, his voice crackling with energy over the secure line. "Ibrahim, my brother, I'm boarding a plane to Ouagadougou right now. We need to talk face to face. Aimee, you don't need to risk. What? Being sanctioned for supporting my neighbor? Let them try. Niger's Tani is flying in tomorrow. It's time for a different kind of summit." As the sun set over Ouagadougou, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that seemed to match the fire of continental awakening, Traoré understood that the UN's calculated punishment had become something else entirely, a rallying cry for African independence that would reshape the continent's relationship with the world. What do you think about this incredible turn of events so far? Are you surprised by how quickly African leaders rallied around Traoré? Or did you see this continental awakening coming? Let us know in the comments what you think will happen next. The VIP terminal at Ouagadougou International Airport buzzed,